Technically speaking, communication experts will tell you that I should be in the frame, but I saw in my last podcast I got chopped off at the top. Sometimes I leave too much gap, which is not good. Sometimes I chop myself off, which is not good, but obviously I'm not paying attention to these. Hopefully you focus on the content rather than these aesthetic details which I get criticized for. Okay, examples of design principles. We looked at the design principles before. If you remember, we just quickly recap. Clearly defined boundaries, proportional equivalence between benefits and costs, collective choice arrangements, monitoring, credibility of the monitor's legitimacy and salience, graduated sanctions, conflict resolution mechanisms, minimal recognition of rights to organize, and nested enterprises for resources that are parts of larger systems, which almost always is the case. So what are the examples? As we mentioned before, hundreds of examples have been case studies have been looked at to confirm that these design principles do hold up, and they are very useful to set location specific, context specific, action specific guiding principles for sustaining the commons. Well-defined boundaries, that was our first one. The first principle relates to two types of boundaries: the boundaries of the resource system itself and the boundaries that determine which individuals or households have rights to harvest the resource. Having clear boundaries is critical to addressing the problem of free riding, so that you don't have people who don't contribute to the system but come in and exploit or harvest the resources, in this case it would be exploitation if they are free riding. If there are clear boundaries indicating who can appropriate which resources, it will be clear who is following the rules and It'll be clear who is following the rules or not when harvesting activities are observed, so that the norms and punishments can be quickly followed up. So now let's use an example that's quite far removed but yet very useful in terms of the penalties and graded increasing penalties. Nowadays technologies help to determine whether a tennis ball is in or out. You see this action replays in all sports where camera systems are used when the decision is in doubt, like this, which is on the line. The player who is going to lose this point might say, I don't agree. Then they have to go to the system and check it, and then there are details such as how many times a player can challenge the call of the referee, so that if you lose a call that the referee was right and you were wrong, then you get penalized, you lose a chance to challenge again, and so on and so forth. Such clear demarcations also help in sports to define the boundaries of the common space for competition. What would John McEnroe do if there were no clear lines on the tennis court? Obviously the lines are everything, because the good player serves an ace, then hits the balls in a way that makes it difficult for the opponent to return it, and so on and so forth. Many sports players wear a uniform and a number that indicates that they were allowed to participate, so you have authority given to you. You cannot just run in the New York Marathon. You have to sign up and wear your start number and start in your assigned position. Also, many internet services require that you register in order to be able to use those services. Even a free article requires you to put in your email address, sometimes create an account so that they can track you. Watching a streaming Netflix movie in the US is possible if you have paid your monthly fee, but it's not possible to do this on the same account on your laptop in China. So there are boundaries, and there are illegal sharings were happening. Netflix realized this was getting too much of a cost for them, so they have done away with sharing. They have made it stricter, and so on and so forth, and they give you a family plan, fixed number of people can share, all sorts of details on how I keep saying exploitation, but harvesting the resource. The shows given by, served by, streamed by Netflix can be enjoyed by subscribers. The reason for this is that the rights for consuming the Netflix content are clearly defined for certain countries for which Netflix owns copyrights. When your laptop uses an IP address outside the US, it will not provide access to the content. Basically, they want to be sure that you are a legitimate user and you're not coming from somewhere with an IP address that is not recognized as a US site. When resource users create boundaries, they can make use of the ecological context, which we talked about in the previous chapter. For example, defining specific areas where one can harvest from the resource makes it easier to monitor and enforce. So you are sustaining the commons now in a more systematic way with monitoring. Clearly defined boundaries are not enough for a successful institutional arrangement, though. One also needs to be able to defend boundaries against potential intruders. But the research shows that clearly defined boundaries are a prerequisite for success. So if you have a transboundary river, if you have transboundary forest or anything else, then fisheries, you have to have more than just institutional arrangements in terms of defending the boundaries against potential intruders who could be free riders, pirates, and so on and so forth. The second one, proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So I hope it's clear why we have to set boundaries for sustaining the commons. Do the rules allocate the benefits from the resource in proportion to the effort put into the harvesting and maintaining the resource? We're talking about sustaining the resource, so it must be about harvesting and maintaining. You have your rights and you have your obligations. I'm mumbling the words. If some users get all the benefits and pay a small proportion of the costs, other users might not be willing to follow the rules over the long term. They might say, screw it, I'm going to do whatever I want. This design principle relates to fairness as well of all the stakeholders, yet some inequality in the benefits people derive from the resource are acceptable provided the cost they bear in relation to the benefit is proportional. For instance, users may accept that the individuals who put a lot of effort into building an irrigation system get a better plot of land to grow his or her crops, assuming that the land is being dynamically allocated, so you have to be careful what this means in terms of getting a better plot of land, but you get the idea. Salary levels, it could be allocation of water itself based on the amount of effort you put into building an irrigation system. Salary levels are a typical topic of debate, especially in periods of economically challenging times, but the gender issues are always there in terms of women getting paid less for the same job compared to men. For the sustainability of an organization, it's not wise to lay off employers while the boss keeps, I think this is lay off employees, while the boss keeps her 7-figure salary. Similar levels of sacrifices are expected over the whole organization. This is always a debate about whether CEOs who can lay off thousands of people are feeling the pain or they are just paid for running the company and not penalized for laying off people. There are important differences between countries in how costs and benefits are defined. For example, because the labor market in the US is more flexible, it's easier to lose a job, and there is only a limited safety net. You quickly get a job, performance is monitored, and you may easily lose the job as well. In various ways, this is a market that is beneficial to many who are not so tied into security, long-term employment opportunities, long-term planning, and so on and so forth. Within Europe, Social Security provides a minimum level of income for people who have no job. How a society allocates its costs and benefits, as exemplified in their rules, is largely defined by prevailing social norms. Fairness within the US relates to receiving benefits based on effort, while in Europe fairness relates to equality among people independent of effort. This is a gross simplification, of course, but as the authors can attest, since both of us have lived on both continents, so they are Europeans who have lived in US, there are important differences in social norms that affect the rules on allocation of costs and benefits. Of course, what's not discussed here is how those social safety nets are provided. Often it comes from higher taxes in US. The battle is always to minimize the taxes or allow enough deductions and let's say loopholes to save on taxes. And the idea is that in a purely capitalistic system, everybody must stand on their own two legs, and no economic welfare, social benefits and safety nets are needed. You have to work hard and achieve your American dream and so on, whereas European societies are more socialist, which is a word that's hated in the US. So tax and benefits often go together, and not everybody agrees on how it's done, right? The third one, collective choice arrangements. People who are affected by institutional arrangements should have a way to participate in making and modifying the rules. They have agency, they have the willingness and ability to act on these systems which they are living in and the rules and regulations that affect them. Action situations where local resource users are able to devise rules are able to better tune those rules to local circumstances. Further, when participants make rules together, they often receive more careful consideration by participants because the rules they make up affect them, as opposed to some government with their policy wonks deciding something based on some data, some strategy, some demands on economic growth and some expectations of risks and so on and so forth. When rules are viewed as imposed by an elite, participants are less likely to comply with them. Then there is a lot of work on how a small group of elites can try to control the system, and then how actually few ignorant stakeholders can put up barriers that actually make it harder for the elites to hijack the system. Okay, universities typically include students in their governance systems, and sport federations have athletes on their boards. These are all ways to include relevant knowledge in the decision-making process, the perspective of students and athletes, and increase the likelihood that the rules are accepted by the broader community. So if there is a large group of athletes or other kind of stakeholders, then if they have representatives on the board that's making regulations, rules, pay grades, lower limits, upper limits, etc., spending caps and so on, they feel better because they know that their interests are represented in the process. So it becomes more accepted by the broader community. In larger organizations or even states, countries and global community, ability of people to participate in rule crafting seems difficult. Okay, the ability of the people to participate, agency, is not always guaranteed. Sometimes we may think the only thing we can do is to vote for who represents us in the decision-making process. One of the big challenges we face in modern times is the large scale of the communities we participate in. Sorry, I blanked out for a minute there because my mind keeps running and I was thinking of something else even as I'm recording this to say something relevant, but I lost the thread anyway. Okay, so let me leave this here, and we will look at the rest of the design principles as we go forward with examples of how they are applied, what are the basic principles in reality in terms of developing regulations based on these design principles. Again, remember, the idea is that you cannot set down the rules, but you can set down the design principles that lead to rules based on the resource, whether it's fisheries, water, agricultural land, pasture, living space, or urban spaces, and so on and so forth. Okay, we'll come back and continue in the next podcast.